Jeremy Schaap is one of ESPN's longest tenured and most respected journalists. Began with the network in 1994, 6 years after graduating from Staples.
That's right. Well, actually, I'm class of 87, but I know the bio online says 94, but I really started working in 93. I feel like they cheat me out of a couple of months.
Okay.
It was really like fall of 93.
All right.
So it was 6 years from Staples.
All right. Truth in journalism.
Yes.
Jeremy hosts E60, Outside the Lines, the Sports Reporters, and other shows. He has covered, I'm going to read this.
Oh, thank
The
you.
Olympics, World Cup, Tour de France, World Series, Super Bowl, U.S. Open golf and tennis, men's and women's Final Fours, New York Marathon, Daytona 500, NBA Finals, Kentucky Derby, and it says on that bio, chess boxing.
Yes, one of my favorites.
Okay,
I
would
can
be my
explain.
favorite too if I knew what it was. Among Jeremy's awards, 14 Emmys, a Peabody, 2 Edward R. Murrow Awards, and ESPN's first ever Robert F. Kennedy Award for human rights and social justice reporting for the conditions of migrant laborers in Qatar before the 2022 World Cup. So I could go on and on.
Please,
I
go
would,
on,
No,
Dan.
much rather talk with rather than about Jeremy Schaap. Welcome to 06880, the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me, Dan.
Sure.
We go back a long way.
Long way.
I don't know how many of your guests go back 37, 38 years with you. Probably a few.
Not too many.
Actually, it's 40 years. I met you in 1985. It's 40 years.
Wow.
That's a long time. You were young. I was young.
Oh,
I was
man.
a tadpole.
I had hair down here. So, 1985, Staples High School.
That's right.
Did you know you wanted to be a sports journalist?
I knew I wanted to be a journalist. I didn't know that I wanted to be necessarily a sports journalist. I was working in sports journalism already in 1985. I was 16, but I grew up in the
sports
business.
for Inklings?
I'm sorry. No, I didn't work for Inklings, but what I did do, so I don't know if you remember Meckler Publishing. It was a publishing house headquartered in Westport at that time. I know it's not here anymore, but it was right down the street from where I lived. I think it's the Galt building now that's kind of right off the 95 ramp. And I got a job there. Essentially, my job was, and they published a bunch of stuff, but including a couple of baseball periodicals. But my job was basically packing souvenir baseballs that were sent as bonuses to subscribers.
Okay.
And then one day, the editor of the magazine and the publisher, I think they had kind of a falling out. So I was called upon to edit the magazine, Sabermetric Review, I think it was called. And they did some very high-end stuff. My work was clearly not high-end, but yeah, I was working in it. And then when I graduated from high school that summer, I worked for, in the summer of 87, I worked for these guys in New York who were creating the official 25th anniversary of Wide World of Sports commemorative magazine. So yeah, I was
With fellow Westporter Jim McKay.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, Jim was not involved in the publication. Well, I guess he wrote the foreword actually, but I was, a news assistant or something like that, editorial assistant. But I was already, eager to start working in the business, but I wasn't sure if ultimately I wanted to work in print or TV, if I wanted to work in sports or news. My father Dick Schaap, he had done all of that stuff. He'd done TV, he'd done print, he'd done magazines, he'd done newspapers. He'd worked strictly as a city-side columnist for the Herald Tribune. He had been a sports reporter, obviously, for a long time as well. So I knew I didn't want to work for a living. I knew I wanted to be in reporting, in journalism, but I wasn't quite sure where.
And have you worked for a living since?
I really haven't. I mean, that's what my father always said, and I think a lot of people who love their jobs say, if you love what you're doing, it's not work. And I mean, it's just been an incredible ride. The stuff that I feel, the stuff that I've gotten to do for the last almost like 40 years, 35, 36 years. as a sports reporter, traveling around the world, doing stories that are meaningful to me, and sometimes you hope they make an impact. I couldn't have, it all seems like a dream sometimes.
Most impactful story?
I think, you just mentioned it. I think the story that probably made the most impact was the story about Qatar that we did in 2014, a few years after Qatar was awarded the 2022 World Cup, and what it brought to light, and how much attention that story got about what was going on with those people who were in Qatar building the infrastructure, building the stadiums, building the transportation, building the hotels, all of that stuff that would be necessary for to make it possible for Qatar to play host to the World Cup in 2022. I think, there are other stories that I think have been important, but I think that one is kind of on a different order of magnitude. And, then there's stories, that make an impact in terms of the way that it makes people feel as well as think. And I've done some stories over the years that I think, have resonated. If I were to pick one in particular, it's a story I did about Bobby Fischer a long time ago, 20 years ago, and about what became of him after he won the World Chess Championship in 1972 against Boris Spassky.
Did he become a chess boxer?
He did not become a chess boxer. No, he became, as you know, Dan, a recluse, and said many hateful and controversial things. Became, someone who was on the run from not only the American justice system, but the global justice system. It's a very complicated and sad story. And that story I still hear about 20 years later.
Wow.
Yeah.
How about the one that has made the most impact on you?
On me?
As a human being.
As a human being. That's interesting. There have been a lot of stories I've done that have moved me. I've done a lot of stories on people in desperate situations around the world, and it gives you a perspective, right, on what we have here. The privileges that I've enjoyed, growing up in the United States, and so I think when you go to a place and you talk to people like in Bhopal, India, who are desperately poor, who suffered so much with the lingering effects of the Union Carbide pesticide plant leak, chemical plant leak, for decades and decades. That story made an impact. The people I interviewed in South Africa, who'd been victims of what they call corrective rape, lesbian soccer players, those things, they stay with you. And certainly, that's the case with the people I spoke to in Qatar, who were in these difficult, horrible situations, being mistreated, doing heroic things to support their families, hundreds, thousands of miles away, sacrificing their own freedom, their own happiness for the betterment of their family. You think about those things and you think about, how lucky you are, right? Sure. And the Fisher story is certainly up there. That's a story that made an impact. And for me, I'd have to think about some other ones. But there have been a lot. I did a story recently documentary about Boomer Esiason and his family and his son Gunnar Esiason, who has cystic fibrosis, and the family's journey for 30 plus years to find a cure for cystic fibrosis. And that made a big impact on me because, you think about that diagnosis and how devastating it is, and to see your child, see your son suffering through that. And, I think at the time Gunnar was born, life expectancy was in the teens or 20s. And to see people say, you know what, we're going to fight this. We're going to do everything. We're going to change this, and against all odds,
Yeah.
and now we live in a world where 90% of cystic fibrosis patients benefit from this drug that has been developed in the last decade, Trikafta, and many of those, most of the vast majority of people with CF, 90% are living basically normal lives now. And so, just to see people who refuse to accept that kind of prognosis and accept that this is what it's going to be, those things make an impact.
And you mentioned Boomer Esiason, who, probably everybody thinks he's got the world at his
right.
fingertips. How about personalities? Who are some of the personalities that stand out?
Oh, God, there's so many. I think about all of the people I've had a chance to interview, to profile, some of them you're just dealing with in game situations and, there's not a lot of depth to it, but you're around them in moments of high drama, high importance. And then there are others that you really spend a lot of time with and you're probing and you're profiling. The person I interviewed the most by far and who I've thought about the most is Mike Tyson.
Huh.
I only came along at the tail end of his career. By the time I got out of college, he'd already lost the championship to Buster Douglas, and he was about to go to prison for rape. And he got out in 1995, and then really, there was another decade of his career after that, which I followed closely and covered closely, many of his fights and being around him a lot and doing these in-depth interviews with him for the last 30 years. That's been a very interesting experience. And, I think about Tyson and the complexities, and you think about why are we still talking about Mike Tyson now, right? This is a guy who hasn't won a big fight since 1988, right? And we were still talking about him. We're still talking about him in a way that we don't talk about, fighters who had more impressive careers, whether it's Larry Holmes or Evander Holyfield. We could go on. Tyson is at the top of that list. There are other people, the Roger Clemenses of the world who come to mind, Charles Barkley's. I didn't cover that much. He was basically wrapping his career up by the time. But, he was a guy, you wanted to be around, who was fun. In soccer, I did a lot. I spent a lot of time covering the U.S. national team in soccer at the 1998 World Cup, at the 2010 World Cup, at the 2014 World Cup. And, Tim Howard's one of my all-time favorites. Baseball, also John Smoltz was one of those guys who was great to be around, to cover. You could go, there are dozens and dozens of dozens, but, people I really spent time with, Bob Hurley and Bobby Hurley and Danny Hurley, they're the only brothers, Bobby and Danny. I've done documentaries about both of them. Danny's counterpart on the women's team at UConn, Gino Auriemma, just unbelievable. One of the all-time greats. I did a
and
conversation
a great
with him. The best.
Yeah.
The best. And I he's the only one I think who's interviewed me though on his podcast of the guys I have already mentioned. And that was fun. And Gino's just unbelievable.
Yeah.
There are so many great characters. There are a lot of characters in college basketball. I haven't, in the old days I did a bunch of college football. But I can't, I wasn't around it as much as I was around college basketball and pro football and pro basketball, and especially baseball and boxing.
So what
Lennox
have you,
Lewis,
what have you learned about sports that, people, I think, put it on a pedestal as something that's both entertaining and important in their lives. But what is it about sports that, makes it so interesting and compelling?
Well, I mean, obviously, Dan, and you know this, there are a lot of elements, right? There are a lot, our big sports events are the biggest events in the world, right? There's a reason why people are more passionate about sports than they are about anything else. People say, oh, the Super Bowl is the biggest sports event in America. No, it's the biggest event, and there's nothing else that's close. Say the World Cup's the biggest sports event in the world. It's the biggest event. There are more people paying attention. There are more people watching. There are more people invested emotionally. And look, I'm a guy who likes theater. I'm a guy who likes music. I like all those other things. But you don't go to a concert and see people lose their minds,
Right, chanting and
right, the way they do. I've been to 3 World Cup finals: France, Brazil in '98, the Netherlands, Spain in '10, and Argentina, Germany in '14. That kind of energy. You don't get outside of sports,
Sure.
right?
And you don't bet on the opera.
No. If you do, you're doing it wrong. And so why is that the case? Because we grow up with these allegiances to teams. We develop allegiances and affections for teams. Part of it is tribal, right? If you're a fan of Celtic versus a fan of Rangers, whatever it might be, or Partizan versus Red Star, again, you could talk about those classic rivalries. And it's also, depending on the sport, a lot of people, participated, or their kids participated. It's just something you're around your whole life. And it's also sometimes I think we lose track of this. It's also what athletes are doing is amazing, right? The pure physical nature of it that we celebrate, as humans, as physical beings, right? What they can do at the highest level, we just marvel at. It doesn't have to be about, I'm a Yankees guy or you're a Mets guy. It could just be about, wow, I mean, look at what Aaron Judge is doing, right? Or wow, look at what Shohei Ohtani is doing, right? We as fellow human beings say, how did they do that, right? So there are a lot of reasons why sports, and I would say in some ways, it's more important than ever, right? It's kind of the last big tent in our society, right? Everybody else, with the proliferation of the digital universe, everybody's siloed in their, little streaming universe or their YouTube algorithm or whatever it is. But the thing that we come back to en masse are the big games, right? And there's nothing else like when I was growing up, right? And I'm younger than you, but it was kind of the same thing when you were growing up. There were only a few channels to watch. There were only a few programs. Everybody had the communal experience of watching the last episode of MASH.
Sure.
Everybody was watching All in the Family or The Jeffersons or whatever the #1 show that year happened to be, right? There's nothing like that in our society anymore. I don't know what the numbers are on something like The White Lotus or something, but they don't compare, right? Like I'm guessing, and I admit I'm guessing. I'm not like a business side guy, but if 40%, if they were getting a 30 share for All in the Family, every night that it was on, meaning 30% of households watching TV were tuning in. Are they getting a 1% for something like The White Lotus or 2%? That stuff, and it's that way with news. It's that way with our nightly news programs, especially. But sports still has that place, because you can't rent the game, and there's no, other league you're going to watch for the most part, other than the big ones.
And ESPN has played a pioneering role in all. I mean, there was nothing like ESPN, and there really still isn't.
Right.
But how has it changed in the 30 years you've been with the network?
Yeah.
How has it changed?
Well, there's just so much more. I mean, if we're talking about, what you can watch, I mean, it's unbelievable. When I started working there, ESPN2 was already on the air, had just come on the air. But that was it. There was ESPN, ESPN2. I think ESPN Radio might have just been started. There was no ESPN magazine. There was no ESPN.com. There were no, 500 channels of ESPN. I mean, I don't know if I'm right, but I know I think every Division I game in everything is on TV now.
Yeah.
And most of them are on ESPN, right? Like everything. Like there's nothing you can't watch. I grew up in an era when there was, what were there, 2 college football games on nationally a year? 2.
Yeah.
Like people take that blows your mind, right? Yeah. And it's just bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Is it better?
You want to watch lacrosse games? It's better if you are a fan and you want to watch, Maryland play Hopkins. Yeah, and you couldn't do that. How could it not be better, right? It's better there. You can watch what you want to watch. Better is a loaded word, though. Better in the sense that, can sports be as heroic, even if it never was heroic, when it's, it's the difference, like it's a classic argument, go back to like Sunset Boulevard, right? Like silent pictures, we had faces versus, a little TV in your house with a 9-inch screen, and that different relationship that you have with, Alan Alda, let's say from MASH, dating myself, of course, versus Rock Hudson or a previous generation, Rudolph Valentino. It's different because there's so much of it.
And there's so much money.
And there's so
I
much
mean,
money.
the
So much
commercialization, the gambling, all that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, it's especially the gambling is a huge change, which is just in the last, the Supreme Court decision was 2017, 2018.
Yeah,
I've kind of lost
very
track.
recent.
Yeah, I just did I've done a couple of panels up at Sacred Heart about it. They're very active in kind of the research side on the impact of sports gambling. And as somebody who has no interest in sports gambling at all, I just not that guy. I don't even understand when they say, I shouldn't probably admit this, minus 500 versus plus. I don't even know what that means. So it's not geared for me.
Right. But they're paying commercials for that help pay your salary.
Oh, definitely. Yes. There's so many commercials. It's interesting too. We did a series on it last year, kind of the state of sports gambling. I think it was a 5-part series on Outside the Lines, and we talked to different entities, and it's an interesting story, right? It's not always exactly what people think because, people talk about the NFL and obviously pro football and the gambling on pro football is the biggest thing. But, it's the NFL that fought this for a very long time. They didn't want gambling.
They said that because our game has got great integrity because there's no gambling.
Right. Well, they always knew there was gambling, but, they didn't want to see it explode, and they fought against it.
That they control it.
Right, whereas the NBA embraced it, right?
Yeah.
And Adam Silver embraced it, I think, earlier than the other commissioners. And at the same time, too, the idea that I don't think, it's an interesting thing because from what I understand, the really big money that these companies are going to make is not from the sports gambling, where the margins are actually relatively small, I think. It's like the casino games stuff. So it's kind of like getting you on the app and then doing casino games and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you got your kids are involved in sports.
Yeah, to an extent. Here in town, skiing is kind of their big thing. Uh-huh. So there's a lot of skiing in the house, which is totally foreign to me. My parents didn't love me enough to take me skiing, teach me how to do it. But we go up to the Berkshires every weekend in the winter, and they ski. And the two younger ones are on ski teams. Now my son, who's 12, he's in the rugby program here, which I know is a big thing, and he's very excited about it. It's just a few weeks in, so he's into that. But, we've exposed him to everything, the water rats here in Westport and, now rugby and the soccer program, which is great, as you well know. And, we got the travel tryouts coming up right in a couple of weeks, and I'm trying to wrap my head around that. Everything's so organized, though, Dan. It's crazy, right?
The youth sports industrial complex.
Unbelievable. Yeah, I think Eisenhower warned us about it.
So what's it like for you to be back in this town? What got you back here?
Well, I've been back a long time now. So I wasn't here very long the first run. So we moved here in 1985 when I was going to my junior year of high school. I'd grown up in the city, and we moved out here. We spent 1 year in Westchester and then moved here. So I went to 4 high schools, Dan, which explains a lot, as I'm sure you remember about me. And then as soon as I went off to college, basically, my parents were divorced, moved back to the city.
Okay.
So it was just a couple of years, but I really always liked the town, and I liked, of my 4 high schools, I liked Staples the best. And there's something special about Westport. And then when I got married and we had kids and we were living in the city, we never really thought about anywhere else. It just seemed, oh yeah, we'll go to Westport. Yeah. And we had good friends who were still living here, especially Joe and Debbie Valerio, who were very close friends, who lived here, raised their 3 kids here. And Joe was the longtime producer of The Sports Reporters, the show that my father hosted, as you know, on ESPN. Yeah. And so we've been back. We bought a house here in 2009. 16 years is a long time. Yeah. And had, 3 kids go through the school system. I think this is what is it? 10th consecutive year at Kings Highway.
Okay.
So yeah, so we're west of the river, people.
Okay.
So it's a whole different, deal over there.
What's your go-to place here?
Oh, that's a tough question, Dan. There's so many places that I really love. I mean, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Coffee and Donut. That's probably the place I eat at the most, as you can see.
You're looking good. You're in good shape.
and then, there's so many good restaurants. We go to Don Memo a lot. Although I think some people say it's Don Memo, but I think, is it Don Memo or Don? I always say Don Memo.
I say Don Memo too.
Okay,
so
I don't know.
That's official between the two of us.
Okay, it's official. At Kawani and the Welk and, Cottage is great. I mean, there's so many great spots. We really enjoy Casame as well. I think it's called Casame. All these places are hard to pronounce.
Right.
Like, is it Nomade? Is it Nomad? I don't know. It's like they're all these silent E's.
Coffee Ann
is easy, which is terrific. But there's so few places that are left from when I lived here in the 80s. Like, trying to think.
Gold's.
There's Gold's, which is tremendous as well.
Yeah.
There's Gold's, and what else is there?
Mitchell's.
No, in terms of food.
Food? It's Gold's, yeah.
No, there's got to be something else. Angelina's, right? Angelina's. But we lived all the way on the other end of town. We never really made it over that far. But I remember the fancy places back then, right? There was the Il Volano, right?
Sure.
Which was right down here, downtown. And what was the French place? Was it called Le Chambord?
Le Chambord.
Yes. And I think the first souffle I ever had. That place was great. Yeah. Oh, we're at Bar Taco a lot. The kids love Bar Taco. I love Bar Taco too. I'm not saying just kids. So yeah, I was disappointed when the Saugatuck, when it was Kraft and they had that little cafe. That was awesome when that went away. But now it's great. They got the Burger Lobster thing, and they got the and they make great sandwiches at Saugatuck Provisions.
Yeah.
Great sandwiches.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a hidden thing, right?
I'll get Matt Stewart on here.
Yes. I'm sorry, I could go on about food.
Your kids having the same experience here that you did, the couple of years you spent here? What's it like for a kid these days here?
I think so. I know that they all love the town, and I think they've loved their schools and their friends. And, it's kind of idyllic, right? I mean, I know there are pressures and, there's all kinds of stress that kids feel that they probably didn't feel in the 80s. And there's social media that you have to protect them from, and their devices and all that craziness, which is rewiring their brains and our brains and all that kind of stuff. So that's different. And then there are, other things as a parent, right, that I hope, you're not going to have to worry about as much, because of Uber and maybe self-driving cars, and, the stuff that you used to worry about with that stuff. But you knew me, Dan, when I was a teenager. I was the kid that, my parents encouraged to get into more trouble, right? So like I didn't like whatever kind
good
of
trouble. John Lewis is good trouble.
Whatever kind of trouble, right? Whatever kind of trouble, there was for kids back then. I was probably blissfully unaware of, and I'm probably blissfully aware of a lot of it now.
Sure. A couple minutes left.
Sure.
So back to ESPN. A story that you haven't done that you would love to do.
Wow. There are so many. I was asked this question recently on one of the industry podcasts. No, it could have changed since then. And, to me, one of the really interesting things in sports right now is the growing influence of Saudi Arabia and the growing significance of Saudi Arabia. And I've done a lot of work in the region, in Qatar, as we mentioned, in Bahrain, in Israel, over the years. So that interests me, what's going on, the outsized influence of Saudi Arabia in sports. That's a good story that I think we're going to be tackling, I hope. I'm actually going from here to a pitch meeting up in Bristol. So that's one thing. So I've got a few of these things on my mind. I'm really interested, as I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Glasgow, about kind of great rivalries and what they reveal about the societies. where they are, whether it's in Glasgow or it's in Belgrade or it's in Buenos Aires. And that's just soccer, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of other sports. We could talk about, the rivalry between India and Pakistan in cricket, or in rugby between New Zealand and South Africa, whatever it might be. And what those things reveal, I'd kind of, it's kind of my dream to do something, like everybody else that's kind of Bourdain-esque, where, you go somewhere and you use as a device maybe rivalries to talk about the world and not just the world of sports. I'm a sports history guy, as you know, so there are a lot of stories about sports history that I would love to go back and revisit. But and I think it's growing up in that era in the 70s where it was just, it was before the explosion of cable, and everybody, was on a giant screen, kind of metaphorically, even though they were on the TVs in your homes. And, that era, I'm always drawn back to it as well.
Greatest venue that you've been in?
Wow, greatest
arena, stadium, city, whatever.
Oh, okay. Yeah, again, I mean, I've been very lucky, right? So I've been to Wembley, and I've been to the Maracana, for a final. That's kind of hard. Those are kind of hard to beat. Although Wembley's new, so you don't feel all that. Right. You don't feel all that history. It's hard to beat Wimbledon. I mean, Wimbledon is very special. Augusta is very special. I'm giving you all the usual suspects. Yeah. One that I think is really cool, and I think it's older than all of them. I might be misspeaking though. Is Lord's, which is, it's kind of the Yankee Stadium of cricket in St. John's Wood in London. And I've been there a number of times. I can't even think why. I just haven't done that many cricket stories, but I've been there a number of times for cricket stories. That's really cool. But you think it's been 200 years they've been playing there, all the legends of cricket. And I don't get cricket at all. I'm trying with this rugby thing because my son's the rugby. I don't get rugby. I'm trying, but I feel like I'm too old to to learn new sports, but I love the history and then there are, what? It's another usual suspect, and I think it's still standing, but it's not the home anymore of the Montreal Canadiens. But I was at the last game at the Forum in '96, and to me that moment was the coolest because this is another story I'd love to do. I don't know if anybody's going to green light it, but to me, what's fascinating about the Montreal Canadiens, right? They are unique, I think, in North American sports as a franchise that represents not only a city, not only a region, but a way of life.
Culture.
A culture.
Yeah.
And a language and a history and that last game at the Forum, and they literally passed a torch. I think Maurice Richard was still, I'm pretty sure he was still alive, the Rocket. And, Maurice Richard was there, and Jean Beliveau was there, and all these names. And when you cover hockey, as I have done over the years, there's something just special about those French-Canadian greats who played for the Canadians, and that connection, which, I grew up as a Packers guy too, because of my father's connection to the Packers. And you think about what the Packers represent in their city, in their state, but the Canadians, and not only that, they're like the Yankees of their sport. Yeah. So being in that old barn where so much history and so many meaningful things had happened, that was really cool for me.
Great. Many more stories to come.
I hope.
I will get you back on the podcast. And next time we can maybe delve into chess boxing.
Anytime. It's, you're laughing, Dan, but it's actually very compelling. And I got a trip to Cologne, Germany out of it.
All right. Last question then.
Yeah.
Is it more chess or is it more boxing?
It's both.
Okay.
You win whoever registers a knockout or a checkmate first wins. You got to pace yourself.
Okay. All right. Sounds like a wide world of sports event.
Exactly.
But at any rate, Jeremy Schaap, it's been great. Thank you for coming on the podcast, and go up to Bristol and pitch your story.
Hopefully we get some green lights.
There you go. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dan.